Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ahead of the Curve. Today, I've got another very special guest, as I do every single week. Matthew Reagan is with me from Pseudo Magic. So, Matt, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I didn't bother to ask you this before, but do you prefer Matthew or Matt?
Oh my goodness. You know, I came to this work by way of the theater, and being in the theater, I was called everything from Matt, Matthew, Mateo. I was called all of my character names at one point or another. So I've given up the kind of illusion that my name is a particular identifier. So it's really whatever's easiest for other people.
Yeah, I feel the same way because when I was in theater, my name is Jeffrey, and I go by Jeffrey with a G because it just gets messed up all the time. I've been called Godfrey, Geoffrey, Geoff, like all kinds of different iterations of my name. It's been so friggin' funny.
There was a small moment in my life when I worked at a Starbucks back when I was a theater student. And my favorite thing was I would write people's names in the phonetic alphabet on their cups, because that way I knew that I could say it. And I didn't try to pretend like I was going to spell it correctly. So
I could imagine the comments that you received from some of the guests were probably like, wow, this is awesome.
Right. There's a lot of confusion.
Yeah. So Matt, can you give us and the viewers a little kind of insight as to where you came from, how you got started, and mixed up into this crazy, insane industry that we live in?
Oh boy, what a strange industry it is indeed. So I arrived in this work by way of performing. I was an actor, dancer, circus performer. It feels like another lifetime ago now. I did my undergraduate work at Cal State Fresno here in California, and I had imagined that I was going to find a graduate program. I was going to get my MFA in theater and performance. I was going to be an actor.
An actor.
Yes, exactly, with a capital A and a flourish. And I ended up in a car accident. I was stopped at a light. I was actually on my way to a production, to a dance show that I was in, and a car hit me. That car, I hit another car. That car hit another car. And luckily, I was fine. Everything was okay. But what did happen is it really changed my direction for graduate school auditions. I had kind of already decided what I was going to do for the ERDAs and kind of MFA auditions. And then all of those plans changed. So
I bet they did, like in a snap.
Yeah, exactly. So my life cornered a little bit. I spent a chunk of time working for educational outreach programs, predominantly with first generation to college, low-income students in the Northeast. Then made my way into educational technology, and really tried to figure out what was the kind of intersection between performance, technology, what were the things that I wanted to do. Because I had also spent that time kind of looking at my friends who had done their MFA work and feeling like, man, I really want to have health insurance, and I really would love to make sure that I can, own a home someday. And like, I didn't know how to reconcile the kind of feast or famine life that my friends were living with the kinds of work that I was doing. And in all of that tumultuous kind of exploring, I imagined I was going to be in the Northeast for 3 years. I was there for 7.
Funny how that happens.
That's life for you. Like, oh, I'll be here for like a minute. And then I was like, it has been a little longer.
It's been a few.
I found an MFA program out at the University of Arizona, Arizona State University, called Interdisciplinary Digital Media and Performance. And it was intended to be the intersection of traditional turnkey tools for thinking about how media is incorporated with performance, and then an opportunity for students to kind of explore and develop their own tools in the gaps that exist around current products on the market. And so I thought, okay, I want to do that. That was about the same time the Amon Tobin tour, the ISAM tour was happening. And I was like, okay, I want to do that thing. And I don't know how to do it, but I want to do that thing.
I'm going to figure it out.
And so that was then I, cornered again in life and jumped in with both feet and the rest of it feels like it was history now.
So how did you end up kind of like, where did you start in terms of media? Did you know that you were going to start getting into generative, or did you start looking at it from more of a creative and artistic approach? And how did you kind of get in? How did you start?
Oh, it's a great question. How did I start in all of this? And I was definitely like an artist with a cap, maybe with a lowercase a, right? I was going to be an actor
with the uppercase A.
Right, but I was definitely an artist with a lowercase. And so that was really the kind of approach I was thinking about. I'd been a videographer, photographer when I was living in the Northeast. That was a passion that I had picked up. And it started to do a little bit of animation. I'd been helping faculty in my kind of work capacity there. And it started to do a little bit of initial programming pieces for automation in courses and some kind of basic web scripting. And so I found myself in this curriculum really thinking about kind of the artistry that I wanted to do. And then I encountered the same problem that I think all of us do, which is you sit down at After Effects, you've made the most beautiful thing, you hit render, and you discover that it's going to be 3 hours before you're going to see what it is that this beautiful thing that you've made.
Yep. And that beautiful thing turns out to not be as beautiful as you were hoping after 3 hours. And you're like, I've got to make some adjustments. I've got to make some tweaks. I don't like this. I don't like that.
Right. I remember there was one show I worked on where I had a piece of media that was the intro. It was a important piece for this show. But I think it was at that time about a 32-hour bake. It was like some big, particular plugin situation for After Effects. And I didn't have like a big beefy server that I was running it on. And we were through like the third iteration. And I remember looking at our director and being like, we only have time for one more of these. So I really need to know what it is that you're not liking so we can get it right.
We got one shot and one shot only. It's like live production.
Exactly. And so I think it was really there that I started to become more and more curious and interested in what do real-time solutions look like? Where are the places that I'm willing to make some compromises for either fidelity or having to pre-make some assets so that I still have the flexibility to kind of dream immediately, see changes right away. The thing I always hated working in theatrical productions is during tech when you'd have to say on comm, media's working, media's working, media's working. No, media is still working.
Media is still working. Media is not working anymore.
That's right. And it always felt dreadful at the end of a tech to have to tell your director and tell your creative team, hopefully you'll see those changes tomorrow, but you might not see them until the day before we open. And so I think those experiences really began to push me into thinking about how can we find the right toolkit, whether we build parts of it or we assemble it in some way, to make that process feel more organic, alive, and responsive, because live events was all about creating a responsive and engaging work, and that was really what I wanted to be doing.
No, absolutely. And I also feel that from that approach, in going into a live environment, you want to be able to manage it organically. And the thing that I've seen some beautiful pieces over the course of the years where they've been choreographed, and the videography is choreographed perfectly to the dance routine or to that piece. And don't get me wrong, it looks phenomenal, but there's that kind of connective part that is not fully there. And I think that's kind of one of the really interesting things in generative media today, is that you can allow performers or actors with capital A's, or dancers, or anybody else to actually be able to create that physical connection between themselves and technology, which is really, really interesting.
Absolutely. I think that's, I found a lot of inspiration from companies like Chunky Move now years ago, but looking at the way that the movement and behavior of their performers was directly informing what was happening in the media. That to me was one of the most kind of inspiring spaces, because it really meant that we were we stopped thinking about the media as being this thing that was in addition to the show, and we were thinking about media as this element that was hidden, a hidden part of the world that was suddenly revealed that we could share in. And that's where I think our kind of connection with data and those pieces becomes really interesting and powerful, especially as a communication tool.
No, absolutely. Helen, welcome to the show. She totally agrees with us as well. Great to have you here. For those of you, again, viewing, thank you guys for tuning in today. If you have any questions at all during our conversation, we keep it very informal. So please feel free to post questions in the comments, comment on what we're speaking about. If there's anything that comes to your mind, please feel free to post it. We definitely want to have some of your input and try and keep the conversation pretty interactive. So yeah, feel free to post away, but we're going to continue on yapping away and hope that you guys enjoy the content that we're providing. So can you, like, going a little bit back from the transition from After Effects into generative media, you know, for those of you who are tuning in, Matt is one of the, I would say one of the leaders in leading technologists and content developers using Touch Designer. So for those of you who haven't known of Matt in the past, if you go and check out his website, there is a plethora of like Touch Designer tutorials going how far back now, Matt?
Oh gosh, back to 2013, I think. Things go back now.
So yeah, so 7 years of
a minute
and tutorials on Touch Designer, which is an incredible tool set. So what I really wanted to kind of ask you is, how did you make the transition? How did you kind of decide to more or less specialize in going with Touch Designer?
Oh boy, you know, in some strange ways it was in some ways it was a little bit because of a feud with a faculty member that I had, and in some ways it was because of the richness of the environment. You know, prior to using Touch, I used MaxMSP, Processing, Isadora, Course Composer, MadMapper. I'm trying to think of what other, Resolume, Modulate. You know, I did the same thing that I think many of us kind of start with, where you have this kind of smorgasbord of tools.
Yeah, you explore, you try and interconnect, you find out what are the upsides of one product, the downside, pros and cons, basically, weighing it down on the scales.
And then you end up in a show. I remember I was working on one production where one of the beautiful parts of my graduate program was that as a designer, or as a media designer, you both did the system design, you did the media design, you did the installation, you built the interface, and then you trained an operator. So you really saw the whole circuit beginning to end, and then you had to turn over the keys to another student to operate. So you really had to think about how you're making something that was going to be relatively bulletproof, so that it could survive a week of production. And in one of those cases, I remember that I was troubleshooting with a student on the phone because something had gone wrong. And we were in like a laundry list of, okay, we're going to turn everything off. We're going to turn everything on. We're going to start like 6 different applications, one at a time, to make sure that they all talk to each other.
They all interconnect
in the right order. And then we're going to turn around in a circle. We're going to, you know, pour some salt around us and then cross our fingers and hope that everything works. And it was at that moment that I began to really question, you know, how can I think differently about the toolkits that I'm using? And I'd found Touch along the way. I was only a Mac user at the time. And so I remember I stayed up until 4 or 5 in the morning one night. I dual booted my little MacBook Pro that I had at the time, and just committed to figuring out how this other framework operated because so many people had talked about it. And that was really kind of the beginning of a transition into using Touch as a framework for both show control, visuals building, mapping, mixing, and all of those elements. To me, Touch Designer has been kind of an interesting environment because it was my entry point into working a lot with Python, and then eventually into working with GLSL, and then thinking about what's C++. And so it really became my
natural evolution of getting into programming, like programming languages or scripting languages, and slowly diving a little deeper, diving a little deeper, and diving a little deeper.
Exactly. And that for me became a really excellent, I've done a little bit of Unity, I've done a little bit of Unreal, I've worked with Notch, and I can kind of see now through the lens of, touch it lets you do a lot of dangerous things. God bless the people at the Derivative. There's a lot of trust they give to users. Like, you can really rightly just bork a computer if you want to. And so I can kind of understand how other frameworks have given you really explicit rails, and also those rails mean that there are some choices that are not available to you, probably for good reason, and a set of choices that are available to you. It's been really helpful for me, I think, from the perspective of how do we design thoughtful systems? What do we expose? What do we not expose to users? And I'm sure that you've seen the same kinds of questions about how do we pick and choose what we expose to a user to be able to manipulate, and when do we make that kind of very difficult choice?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of breaking it down into, well, it really comes down to a number of questions, I'm sure, that we can create a whole other conversation around. But, the few basics is what does the final result need to be, what needs to be achieved, and what parameters need to be exposed in order to accomplish the end result. And also give some fluidity, because when we're really looking at it, you're looking at data control or exposing data control from some incoming point of data from an external application, or from, somebody even pushing buttons or controlling faders or whatever. But it's all these different variable types of data that we're trying to, hand over the keys to, and hope that the end result still comes out hopefully the way that it was meant to.
Sensibly, hopefully.
Fingers crossed.
Oh, I really didn't, I think the other interesting thing about this field is that I kind of entered my graduate program imagining that there was going to be someone that was going to teach me the right way and the wrong way to think about this particular kind of mode of communication, how to make content, all those pieces. And I've quickly realized that there's not really right or wrong. There's efficient and inefficient ways to solve problems. But, whether you do it in this like circuitous around the world kind of way, or you cut a direct path, at the end of the day, it's really about, is it working or is it not working?
Absolutely. So how do you feel, in your view, how do you feel generative media changes the way that we're experiencing things? Oh. And
sorry,
I know that's again another bit of a tough one, but it would be interesting to have your viewpoint on that.
Well,
especially coming from a performance background.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think, it was really interesting. We worked when I was at Arizona State University. We had an opportunity to work with a department called Arts, Media, and Engineering, and one of the instructors there had worked with the Bill T. Jones Company on a piece that used dancers and sensor data on dancers for their performance. Ultimately, when the piece toured, they didn't have the bandwidth to take all the operators, all the equipment, everything to do the same interactive show. So they did one good take, they made an edit, and then the dancers performed their choreography to choreographed media. The conversation with the dancers is what was really interesting. That while the audience mostly didn't feel different between the entirely choreographed, from a media standpoint, the baked media versus the live media, the dancers felt so much more agency and connection to their work when they knew that what they were doing was driving the actual content that people were seeing. And I think that's one of the pieces that is particularly interesting and inspiring, in part because you want your performers to be engaged and activated and excited, but and it's the performer's job to do that. But as an actor and as a curious person, I think one of the pieces that's really most exciting to me about going to live events is that there is a certain amount of risk that's involved.
Yeah. Oh, hell yeah, there's risk.
Right? Things can go wrong. Someone can forget a line, right? Like there will be an entrance that's at the wrong point, an exit that's at the wrong point. And when our media systems enter this same risky and unknown territory, we have a different relationship to them. Rather than just being part of the scenography, like, okay, great, it becomes a character that is engaged in this story that we're telling in a way that's much more dangerous, I think, than if it's only pre-baked, planned ahead of time, choreographed down to the millisecond. I think there's absolutely still a place for that. We're not going to ever get away from that. But the liveness of our media changes our relationship to it. And I think that's part of what I really love about thinking about the world from a generative art perspective.
Yeah, I find that now's a really interesting time too, because there's a lot of there's been a lot of work that's been going on in kind of hybrid media, you know, like taking pre-rendered, pre-baked assets, especially when you're working on extremely large canvas sizes, and then basically compositing generative pieces on top of the pre-baked content. And
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, a lot of it, of course, is performance driven, and you know, making sure that you can render out that many pixels out of the systems that you're using, which is always a huge feat. But you know, it's been really interesting exploring some of these hybrid approaches, especially a lot in kind of more themed environments, or you know, theme parks, for example, where you have a ride that's set to do the same thing over and over and over and over again, where you can kind of mix it up a little by adding generative pieces on top and compositing them on top. What are your thoughts on the hybrid approaches? Like,
you know, we use hybrid style approaches at Obscura all the time, and partially for exactly that reason, right? We had canvases that were, you know, it's funny to think about, these canvases were so big, but you know, a 20,000 pixel canvas 4 years ago is still a healthy amount of pixels to try and think about.
mm-hmm.
And so we frequently were trying to wrestle with, okay, what can we make that's kind of known and established? And then where can we find the little Easter eggs or interactive pieces that we layer on top that are still engaging and inspiring? I think that kind of staggered layered approach also is extremely helpful for clients that tend to be a little more risk averse, because you want to have some component of this that you know, you trust, is everything is beautiful, it's been approved, everyone's seen it and signed off on it. And maybe there's just a little bit of sparkle that is a place where someone can make a discovery or see something new every day.
That's the eye.
Right, exactly.
That piece that strikes your curiosity.
Well, it was interesting. We did a piece, Obscura did a piece for MGM Cotai, their big spectacle hallway, which is really a giant atrium, and it's an enormous area. There's LED panels that line 4 different walls in all sorts of different abstract orientations. And one of the interesting conversations we had with them is we built a whole content program that they ran out of Disguise, and then we built a generative media system that ran parallel to and was kind of crossed between with another mixing system that they had installed there. And what was interesting was that the fixed media pieces had a really explicit duration. You could only run them for the length of the clip, right? But the generative pieces, they kind of pleasantly uncovered that those could become these very flexible elements that would stretch for 2 or 3 times as long as they thought that it needed to sometimes, or they could compress it down and only treat it as a transition. And that, you know, that kind of flexibility again goes back to, I don't want to wait for this to render. I don't want to wait for this to, you know, bake out and do 16 other things. I want to know that I have a flexible approach to think about really engaging with the space and how people are navigating the space that they're in, rather than allowing the media to make all the decisions for me.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who haven't checked out MGM Cotai, it is a remarkable space. You should check it out on, I think Vimeo and YouTube actually have videos kind of illustrating the space itself. But the work and the content that you guys produced for that space was just absolutely stunning. I mean, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work.
That was, to your point about resolution, that was really an interesting question. The canvas in that particular, that we worked with, because we kind of spatialized the whole thing, right? We unwrapped all of the pieces to try and understand how big is the media space. And we wanted to respect that, even if screens weren't adjoined, this invisible space between them, something should take time to traverse that invisible space, right? The other world that our windows were letting us peek into. So when we
dimension.
Right, exactly. So when we unfolded the canvas, we ended up, I remember, I think I dropped something when I finally ran the numbers, and it was roughly 64,000 pixels laterally was the canvas that we had to work with. And so part of my challenge, as in a purely kind of engineering capacity on part of the project, was to try and understand, okay, how can we take this 64,000 pixel canvas, and how can we render real-time content for that? What's the trick that we're going to use to be able to create continuity across all of these pieces and think of making a single 3D scene rather than we're going to kind of make
slice it, dice it, see how this might composite it, see maybe this piece might work with this one. Not too sure about what happens exponentially over here.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a really interesting adventure to try and really think differently about how you imagine worlds, how you drive your rendering systems, and then how you think about making pieces for that. They're going to be reusable and reversible in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's always a big challenge, I think, when it comes to content and content design, is reusability of that content, and also tiring the content. So there's always basically a lifespan on pre-baked content, where I think generative really starts to come into a much more interesting area. Because I think when you're looking at it from an investment point of view, or from a client point of view and a customer point of view, you've got, one thing I think that people have always had a tough time with, and I don't like to get into money too much, but the budgets for content are always kind of a secondary thought, for a lot of clients. And it's also one of the most expensive parts, trying to educate a client as to why content costs just as much, if not more, than the system they're installing is always a huge challenge. And it's hard to be able to educate the customer on why there is such a huge cost associated to it. And it makes it even harder when there's a cost associated for a piece, unless you're doing a live event, of course, or one-off or something where it's very specific. But when you're repurposing or reusing a piece of content that costs, 100,000, 200,000, $500,000, depending on the content that you're producing, and being able to justify, well, it's this much money because there's all this creative work that has to go into it, and these workflows have to be thought out, and you're building content again for canvas sizes that are usually unheard of, at least traditionally. And that part of it, I find, like the educational part of it from a financial part, and the reusability is a really hard thing to get across. So how have you managed to kind of get around that, or what's been the approach?
Well, part of what it's interesting. I've worn a couple different hats. So sometimes I'm in the room with a producer, sometimes I'm in the room with a client. These days, it's pseudo magic. We all wear all the hats, so we're all in the room all the time, which is a little different than my Obscura days. But I think we always start conversations around thinking critically about how long and how flexible you want something to be. Because I think, especially on the generative side of the equation, when we were working on one project, Obscura, we framed it as, we can approach this where you can have a piece of artwork that's going to drive the parameters of this generative element. So we're essentially giving you a bunch of different modules that let you remix and rematch pieces of artwork that you've commissioned. So rather than just thinking about the slideshow that you're going to create, let's think about how you can take that existing piece of artwork that you made that big investment in, and then manipulate that, change it, explode it, come back to it. And there's a flexibility in approaching the work from that perspective that means that little module, right, that little plugin that we made for you works with any of the artwork that you've purchased. And so it's not like you're getting that once, you're getting that for any of the kind of combinations or permutations that you want to explore.
So let's go off the rails a little bit and talk a little bit about AI.
Okay.
And, there's been a lot of headway that's been made, especially in the digital art scene with artists like Rafiq Anadol that have been creating these massive, all kinds of different types of GAN created content from different neural networks. And, some of that stuff has been absolutely stunning. But I'm really interested to find out what your thoughts are on utilizing AI inside of generative media. And to see if you've been tinkering around or any explorations that you've done.
Oh yeah, you can't not tinker with it. I think one of the things that you absolutely discover quickly is that it is not nearly as controllable as many of the mechanisms that we've previously used. So unlike noise functions or random functions where we kind of have some sense of how we can manipulate and shape the outcome, AI systems, you might spend days training a data set only to find that what you got is not particularly useful. You got to train another data set or adjust the weights going into it. So I think that's one piece that's really both exciting and interesting, because I love imperfections in artworks. I think that's part of what makes them kind of unique and fun.
Absolutely. I mean, look at glitch.
Right.
Glitch effects.
I think that's harder sometimes to sell to a client, though, when you don't have a perfect way to be predictable about what they're going to get on the other side of it. That's a really interesting navigation to enter into. Where I think we're going to see, and I've said this before, I'm trying to remember, I think it was in an LDI a couple of years ago, is that I think the AI applications we're going to see more than anything are going to be so painfully banal that we will hardly realize that they're inside of the systems that we're working with.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting work that's been done around AI systems that train or models, rigged models that teach themselves how to walk, right? So you run the training system for a couple, many thousands of iterations, and this model that you put the bones in, but you haven't trained it on any walking styles, all of a sudden it knows how to ambulate itself. And you might, for example, think about, okay, well, what if I wanted to take my model of a monster and I wanted it to walk in the style of Baryshnikov? Those are the kinds of interesting places that we can start to imagine as a future with AI applications. The folks that are making digital humans have also done really incredible work with markerless targeting and remapping of facial structures. So the ability to puppet digital models or digital avatars, digital humans, without needing complex kind of mapping systems or multi-camera situations, and being able to do that in real time. That's, again, like a place that is really exciting, interesting.
Yeah,
we're only going to see more of that.
I've been a huge advocate of computer vision technology, and I am wholeheartedly convinced that motion capture systems within the next few years are going to be they're not going to be the conventional IR systems anymore. They're going to be AI computer vision driven cameras that'll be able to pick up on different facial features, expressions, location, and just be able to track whatever you tell it to track in that location and stay on target.
Exactly. That's the things you see with YOLO, with PoseNet, with Wrench, right? Like there's an explosion of frameworks that are solving some of these problems that we previously imagined required very expensive, dedicated imagers for. And now we're doing the same kind of joint-based detection and tracking with just an RGB webcam, which is mind-boggling. It's a really exciting time to be thinking about sensing solutions, because we're moving away from this kind of like, it's got to be this sensor, and oh, by the way, you need a special computer for it. Oh, and there's going to be firmware that we're going to update 6 times, and the one in the middle broke everything, but it's okay, I promise. And your frameworks have got to be updated.
And it's going to cost you $10,000
Oh,
or
I mean,
$30,000.
on sale. You're lucky. You're lucky I gave it to you I gave you a discount.
So yeah, I think the future is definitely in terms of AI. I find that a lot of the AI tools that have gone into, what we've been used to today have been more purpose driven, I guess, like using AI to do facial reconstructions or photo reconstructions, or training it to for ray tracing, and doing ray tracing technologies, and training neural networks to better themselves for ray tracing, or manipulating ray tracing. How do you feel about it in a more artistic approach, though? In a more artistic sense, and using different neural networks and libraries, as they're called, for media.
I think there's a bunch of really exciting, interesting work there. My partner recently did a piece for their thesis show. They completed an MFA program at UC Santa Cruz, and they used a whole portion of their work was all founded around style transfer and using a catalog of images that they had already collected. And the kind of ideas there were thinking about dreamscapes and kind of visions of worlds that we hold inside of ourselves, but aren't necessarily perfect representations of the world that we see outside. So I think there's a huge amount of space that we're going to explore more and more, I think, for systems that begin to dream by themselves. I say dream by themselves, but really dream based on the inputs that we have given them in the conditions that we have arranged. Right? Like,
we're being replaced, people.
I think that's the other part that I really struggle with, is that there is a kind of there's a real fear about what's machine learning going to do to the role of the artist. And I tend to encourage artists to think about the fact that it's not that they're going to be replaced, it's that they're going to have a different set of tools and a different collaboration system than they're used to. Right? You might say, in the style of Van Gogh, and like while you were listening to Chopin, what does this video look like? Or here's a more interesting, right? Like a place that I think begins to become really transformative is, here's a catalog of all the artwork that I've created. Like, what's your interpretation, dear little machine learning system, of who I am as an artist? And how can I reseed and manipulate this kind of reflective look at who I ought to be, or might be, or could be, or in some weighted system might represent. And I think it's our kind of manipulations and disruptions of some of those systems that's going to be really fun and transformative.
So I'd love to ask the people that are viewing what your thoughts on AI is. I mean, it's kind of new. It's relatively new. I'd say that the terminology has been around for a while. We're starting to get a little bit more used to hearing about it. We've got I think, a much better understanding of what it is now over the course of the last few years. So I would love to hear your thoughts. If you guys think of it as a future-based item, how you guys feel about it inside of technology, especially inside of live events and live event technology moving forward. I think it's very interesting to take a look into that, and just what you guys feel about it. Are you guys scared? Are you guys excited? It would be interesting to have some feedback from you as you're watching. So Matt, I wanted to I'm just going to shift gears again on us, because we're kind of all over the place, and I've got so much I want to talk to you about over the period of time. But when you're building media, on the side as an artist and creating your own works, what really fascinates you? Like what things are you really drawn to, and that you like to, that just fascinate you and kind of motivate you to push into these different areas?
That's a great question. I found a particular fascination with crafted artifacts. So that's I did a whole series of plotter-based art that was really kind of fun and interesting. Kind of imagining, what is this? How do we think about 3D worlds that end up in a 2D projection, but the 2D projection is really represented on a material, and that material that like materiality of that is also a part of the whole kind of continuum of what this piece is. So that's like one avenue is just thinking about relationships of physical materiality to how we are approaching and constructing those in the imaginary virtual spaces that we typically work in.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I had one element that I continually come back to, it's probably explorations of noise and manipulation of pseudo-random patterns. Especially pseudo, hey. Especially because we see them in everything. And I think it was a sound artist friend who was reading a book about how you can manipulate a little bit of pink noise into becoming everything from the backfire from a car to the crinkling of leaves to the falling sound of snow. You know, if you push on it and manipulate it in the right way, you can take what seems like a relatively noisy starting point and massage that into something that has the same shape as the organic world around us. From a visual standpoint, I feel like I can't not see that anymore. I see it in wood grain patterns. I see it in stucco. I see it in concrete. I see it in cityscapes and the way that we lay out cities. There is a kind of structured disorganization to the world that we live in. So the presence of entropy and how entropy kind of collides with our notions of constrained control and chaos is really curious to me, I think.
Yeah, I know for me, it's always been like manipulating physics within a digital world.
Ooh, that's great.
And yeah, it's, we're always trying to work on things like, all kinds of different simulators and different ways of being able to manipulate the physics in the virtual space. And I find that we're getting like really, really close to being able to do it. But I always feel that there's something that's still missing, like that. No matter how much we train a computer, or no matter how much we try to manipulate like real life actions, we get really, really, really close. But for me personally, there's always like that little tiny hint of something that just goes, okay, that's cool. I know that's water. I know that those are waves. I know that the waves are crashing, and I'm seeing the disbursement of the water as it crashes and collides. And then the wind elements, of course. But there's always just part of me that, like, in my brain goes, looks like water, but it's not water.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious about your thought. I have a kind of tenuous relationship with this notion. I'm curious what you think here. Is that, what are your feelings about our obsession with recreating photorealistic worlds with a tool set that could create anything? Like, why is it that we want to recreate a thing that we could take a photograph of? That's our obsession, rather than dreaming bigger.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to go now. And you know what? I think it's part of the I think it's really a challenge. I think it's the challenge of being able to recreate something from real life that is physically around us into something that is virtual and that is not. And trying to basically trick ourselves. I really think that we have a true fascination, and maybe we're a little bit seductive in wanting to challenge ourselves to recreate reality. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. Like video games are a really good, I think a really good example of creating worlds that we're trying to create worlds that are very similar to our current surroundings in a lot of ways, so that we can relate to them, but also take us away from where we are today. I think that in some cases, it's just a way to be able to illustrate you going to another place without actually physically traveling there. And the whole fascination of that kind of really comes into play in creating these environments, right? At least that's my take on it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it, of course, comes into the psychology of it all.
Absolutely.
And one other thing that I've always been fascinated about is that we as humans, when we come into contact with ourselves, we are really fascinated by humans and human connection and, like there's been a lot of art pieces that have been created where you are the feature of the piece, and they've always been wildly successful because we're just curious.
We love mirrors. We love cameras, right? There's never a more pure moment than a camera in an art installation with a kid, because they are like, it's a magnet, and they're like,
seeing things move and wave and crash and all kinds of crazy stuff.
Exactly.
So Matt, we're kind of coming up to our 45-minute time. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege having you here with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Absolutely. No, my pleasure. For those of you watching, if you want to get a little bit more insight onto Matthew and his work, please go and check out his website, www.matthewreagan.com. Also, he has founded a new company not too long ago, right?
That's true. We started Pseudomagic.
That's right.
Which is a very exciting, we kind of discovered that in this weird space that we're all kind of entering, that more and more you find creative agencies that have these really big ideas about executing these kind of complex and nuanced technology-driven installations and experiences, but they might be missing that technology partner to help them bridge that gap between their design and innovation and execution. And that's really kind of all of the folks on the team have worked in some capacity in that spectrum. And so we really are aiming at being the kind of bridge builders and partner to help folks figure out how to take that big, crazy idea and bring it to life.
That's awesome. And I wish you nothing but the best of luck with that, because that's something that is definitely really, really well needed across a multitude of different industries. So I can't see how you will not be successful with that and that approach. Yeah, fingers crossed. But for those of you watching, thanks again so much. We are going to stay on as we usually do. We're going to try and stay on through about the 1 hour mark. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Matthew is also going to be speaking at the upcoming Framework Conference. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, please check out framework-community.com. There's going to be a lot of phenomenal speakers that are going to be there. So I'd highly advise you guys checking it out. Lots of great content is going to be shared over the course of the weekend. And it's kind of a new initiative as well to help us as a kind of a digital community across a whole bunch of different kind of industries between digital art and live events and themed entertainment, and you pretty much name it, anything that can have content within it. It's a chance to basically form a sense of community and come together. So highly advise you guys checking that out. And as I say every single week, thanks for tuning in and stay ahead of the curve. So Matt, again, thanks, dude.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It was really lovely to be a part of this.
Absolutely. So for those of you who are viewing, if you have any questions, I know we've been posting it throughout the episode, but if you have any, it would be great to kind of hear from you now. We're kind of opening it up, much more casual conversation. So if you guys have any remarks, any questions, anything at all, please don't hesitate to post. And we're just going to kind of continue on our technology banter because, well, that's what we do.
I had a thought about when you're talking about kind of AI applications and where things are going to go. One of the pieces that I worked on with UCLA that might be interesting was we looked at this person tracking system that could be trained on a performance. So what does it mean if the AI system or the person tracking system involved in the theater knows the entrances and exits of your performers? What if the show system can begin to learn what the play is and what the choreography of it is? And how can it begin to anticipate, this is when this, lights come up here, or we've entered this new scene, or this other piece changes.
That's really interesting.
Right, our kind of like, our relationship with intelligent spaces, I think, is going to be a really curious artifact of our relationship to AI in the future.
Yeah, I was playing around with some ideas along the same lines when I was working at Float 4 about using AI systems and training the systems within the software that we're creating to be able to gauge how audiences react during certain times of a performance and train it so that, you know, if the audience pulls out a bunch of lighters and it's more of a ballad, says, oh, you know, like it's a slower song, it's creating this environment, it's kind of bringing it in, to be able to say, hey, okay, we need to change the media now, bring it down a few notches, make it a little more intimate, you know, and train systems to be able to gauge audience reaction, to be able to adjust the content for the mood that's being created during that moment.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I thought that, yeah, and trying to bring up different ideas to be able to use AI and in those different means and in those different ways. But unfortunately, we just didn't get too far down the road, but I'm hoping to get down there at some point. So Mason, yeah, absolutely, man. We're just going to have to wait and see where it takes us. But I think it's going to take us in some really good directions. And I don't see, you know, I can't see AI ever really replacing us. I can see it doing a lot of menial jobs that we don't want to do. You know, like parsing through data, tons and tons of different types of data formats, and being able to parse all that out and being able to organize it and all that stuff. I can definitely see AI systems trained and know how to do that. Because a lot of it, of course, is algorithms and figuring out algorithms and figuring out ways to be able to apply them to different means. But I don't think it's ever going to replace us as humans in what we're capable of doing.
I'd love to see a system, you know, Adobe, if you're listening, here's a free idea. Right? You know, look at, because we, you know, I don't know about other folks, but it's not uncommon for an application to say things like, can you send back anonymous data so that we can make our product better? I usually say, yeah, sure, cool, fine, whatever. But to use some of that information, because After Effects has like a little graph that it uses sometimes to like for inspiration and ideas. And I'd love to see a feature that was the writer's block of After Effects, right? When you're starting and you're like, I don't know where to go next. I don't know what path to take. Knowing that it had watched me in the past and could, you know, make a suggestion that was like, you know, you've tried this in the past. What about this technique?
That's yeah, that's an interesting concept. I mean, you start to see that as well in products like even PowerPoint. You know, they're starting to come up with design ideas based on a couple of pieces that you put into a slide. And it's like, hey, I generated all this stuff. What do you think about these looks? You know, and, you know, it's not AI driven, but it's starting to get to a point where that data is being analyzed and suggestions are being made based on what you're putting into something.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really good first step to see where the AI goes. So Mason's got a question. Do you think generative media will encourage artists to produce more unique and original content instead of cookie cutter content?
Ooh. I don't know. That's a good question. You know, I can't imagine that we're going to leave a world where we need things like every VJ is going to want like a bank of pre-made loops that's kind of like in that same cookie cutter kind of world. You know, B-roll and stock footage are things that I don't think that we're going to move away from. I do think that it does apply some pressure to think differently about how can you integrate some of those generative ideas into your work as a conventional artist. And I think that's the space where I get really excited, especially when I talk to artists that feel a little hands-off about kind of generative approaches, are, you know, using that to say, well, you know, what if you just like imagine that data was in your palette, just like, you know, these other materials or these other kinds of techniques were in your palette.
Yeah, what about data-driven content? So we're starting to hear that a lot. And I think data-driven is a very kind of abstract way of being able to describe it because, you know, there's all kinds of different types of data that can be used to create visuals. But what are your thoughts on that from an artistic standpoint in actually being able to evolve and change media.
I love data-driven interventions because I think that's a way not only to make something kind of like banally, lamely kind of like constructed, like here's a big array of numbers, right? But
Check
what's the story that we tell with that? How is that meaningful to me? How can we use that information to either have a compelling action, to have a dramatic moment, or shape and change some of our understanding about what's happening either in a performance or in our lives? And I think, we're seeing some more of that. It's interesting. My PG&E is a power company here, and they now send little bills, or not bills, they send us something ahead of your bill that's like a rating, like here's what you're using in comparison to what your neighbors are using. You're doing great, or you're doing okay. You could be doing better. But those kinds of feedback mechanisms give us an opportunity to kind of reflect on ourselves. And I think data-driven mechanisms for media do the same things for actors, for dancers, right? Like as an actor, I know there were plenty of times that I got notes about I had a favorite side or position on stage, right? Like you're always up left. I need you to come down right a little bit. And what if our media systems also helped give us those clues and insights into our behaviors?
Yeah, agreed. So Scott's got a very interesting question. Hopefully we'll be able to answer it in the amount of time that we have left. But where do you see the direction of the future heading, considering the convergence live versus virtual events, considering real-time virtual production techniques and data-driven content?
Whew. Where is
Yeah.
the future going to go?
That's a bit of a doozy. Thanks, Scott.
Yowza, Scott.
Yowzas indeed.
Well, it's curious, right? It's a really interesting moment that we find ourselves in, because we are suddenly both hungrier than I think many of us have ever been for live events to come back, and also hyper aware about what it will mean to be back in live shared spaces, communal spaces again. So our relationship there is going to be really interesting. I think that when concerts and live events start to come back online, I think people are going to want to go, in part to be present with other people, and in part because those kinds of shared community experiences are very different than what we experience in this kind of more direct screen to human interaction. But it will have some really interesting angles on it, I think. Like, what are your thoughts there?
I've kind of gone over this. I think we've spoken about this a number of times over the past few months, engaged it with a number of different speakers. And it's an interesting time right now because, us, again, as I mentioned before, us as humans, we're going to want to be present. We're going to want to be physically engaged and involved. I don't think, we're all being very, very cautious and hopefully optimistic that there's going to be a cure. But even if there is a world where there's not a cure for what's happening around us today, we are humans and we're going to persevere one way or another, and we're going to push forward. And even right now, you're seeing a lot of things happening where the lockdowns things are being loosened up a lot, and people are back outside. We're still seeing numbers kind of, go up, but people are going to live. They're going to engage. They're going to want to be present. They're going to want to connect in different ways. And I think right now we're entering a world that is new, some ways a little bit scary, but I think that when it comes into kind of the convergence between live versus virtual, I think that there's going to be a really good place for it to live, I guess is the way I put it. I think that there are areas that technology is going to help make things better, but it's kind of like going into a new territory where you're experimenting and you're not too sure what works and what doesn't work. And I think there's going to be a refinement period of time where there's going to be some huge friggin' possible disasters that might happen, but we're going to learn from them and we're going to change those and we're going to make it better, because that's what we do as a human, as humanity. And I don't think we covered the entire question that Scott is going for. I'm hoping that we have hit some of the points, but it's a tough one to really answer well. got me scratching my head.
I think we've got some really unique opportunities for new interventions that imagine worlds that have co-located and remote participants, and what that relationship that we're going to create and bridge looks like. Because, right, we've mostly approached these problems where it's like everyone's at a distance or everyone's together and we have there's no gradient. And I think the future is probably going to be a little bit of gradient. So, what are the kind of mixtures of the South by Southwest perfume style concert where you can choose which live stream you want to jump to? What's that intersection with a Fortnite-like experience where you're at the show virtually exploring via avatar? It'll be weird. It's going to be totally weird, unexpected, but I think it's a place where there's opportunity for lots of innovation and exploration right now.
Absolutely. I think the biggest challenge is the interconnect between the performers and the audience itself. Because if I've already heard stories of different events that have been going on, especially like comedy routines where you've got comedians up front and they live off of the audience's reaction to gauge the flow of their show. And there's been past shows that have happened where they've tried to virtualize it, where the comedians are doing a pitch but don't have any interaction between who their viewers are, and they don't really know where to go with the show, so it doesn't do very well. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is trying to find that interconnect between the performers and the audience engagement, and being able to create that energy that we have when we're in that environment, which is why I think we'll start to still see these kind of hybrid-based events where they're not as large or mammoth as they have been in the past, but they'll still be large enough to be able to create at least a general vibe of the event, so that when people are watching it in a virtual environment, they're still getting the same kind of reaction.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
And that's going to be a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
So Rob's got a question. I'd like to just kind of close things out with his question.
Yeah.
So,
hi,
Rob. So Rob's asking, how do you think community-created tutorials on Touch Designer will move the platform and people's understanding of it forward?
Oh, that's such an interesting and exciting way to end, since we started with some kind of discussion about how much the platform has exploded in the recent months. And I think it's, like other tools, processing, Isadora, MaxMSP, Blender, right? Like, there's a real exciting space for people to be able to share the work that they're doing and the discoveries that they've made. And I think we're kind of in a weird renaissance for Touch Designer in that respect. There was, I was listening to Elbers Sarkavi the other day. He was doing an interview and he talked about how there's this like old guard of Touch Designer users. There's this like middle ground, and then there's this new group.
Ew.
You're right, and I feel like I'm in this weird like middle ground because when I started using it, there were not very many materials, and I spent a lot of time just trying to record what I was doing, so I had some breadcrumbs to get back to solving problems. And we're in a space now where you're seeing more and more people excitedly find ways to share the things that they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that's, we see those kinds of explosions with things like After Effects, C4D, Blender. And I think that's something that we can be really excited about, in part because it means there's a kind of tipping point for the penetration of the platform, how ubiquitous it's becoming, and people's engagement with it. So my hope is that it's a good sign for the toolkit. and for people who are trying to understand how to explore worlds of procedural generation and real-time art making.
Absolutely. And there's been a lot of platforms that are now out that allow for collaboration and that allow for people to be able to publish tutorial videos, be able to publish art, be able to publish pieces. You start to see social media really coming into play, where people are posting project files and how-tos and all kinds of different types of things to be able to help these platforms move. The really interesting part that I find about some of the software that you've mentioned, like Blender and Touch Designer, is now they're really matured. They've been around for a long time, and you can almost call them like a legacy-based product, but they're not, because they're constantly changing and evolving and moving forward. And I think that's the sign of a really good tool or a really good piece of software, something that survived the times. And times in our life is short. If you're talking about a piece of software that's been around for 10 years, you're like, man, that is archaic. Like, that's
what
an old
is to survive and evolve that long, right?
Yeah. And there's software that's been out there much longer than that now that have kind of helped push the boundaries and evolve and change. And I think that's one of the really cool things about products like Touch Designer and Blender is they've just gotten better. And I think they've really gotten better because they've built this incredible sense of community around them. And the people that use the products are loyal as hell to those products. Like, they are bound to those products and support them through and through. And it's really important to have that support as a community, because that makes better tools.
Well, I think it's also, you get a little taste of the freedom that you're provided with a toolkit like Touch, and then suddenly you don't want to let go of that. You're like, no, I can conceive of scenes, environments, transitions, however I want to think about them. I don't have to kind of adhere to another platform's rules or structures. So I don't want to play by your rules. I want to create the world that I live inside of. There's like maybe a little bit of kind of like rebel anarchist energy there sometimes, but I think that's also what keeps it exciting.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think that it's also, again, going back to creating really good product, the best products are the ones that suit the mindsets for many and not the mindsets of one. And it's a really, really hard thing to do. It's extremely challenging and difficult. So I always commend and hats off to the people and the companies that have been able to make that happen, because it's really tough.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, we kind of run past our time. Again, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me today on the show. And of course, for the viewers, thank you guys so much for your support. This has been one crazy ride. I never even thought that I was going to, when I created Ahead of the Curve, I had no idea what it was going to become or what it's going to be. It's just been, well, it's been an evolution. This is the way to put it. So thank you guys for tuning in. I've got a really interesting speaker that's going to be coming on next week. One of my good friends, Yannicka Mikkelsen. She is a VR cinematographer, and she's been very successful. She's also a Guinness Book of World Records holder, which is something that we'll be speaking about a little bit next week, and done some extremely interesting cinematography inside of the virtual space. So please come back and join us with that conversation again next week. So Matt, thanks again so much for joining me. And for those of you tuning, please come back next week and stay ahead of the curve.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, everybody.